All right, in this session, we are going to begin three chapters that are among the most difficult in Revelation to understand, to interpret, to figure out what's really going on in them. But we're going to give it our best shot, okay? Chapters 17, 18, and 19 are about something called Babylon or Mystery Babylon. And that's what we're going to be looking at in this session and in the next two sessions. So in chapter 17, Mystery Babylon is described. In chapter 18, we see Mystery Babylon being defeated. And in chapter 19, we see the song of victory over Babylon. The first question is, what is Babylon? Is it a person? Is it a city? Is it a power? About all we know for absolute certain is that it's evil, that it's opposed to God. It's probably centered in a city, but, well, let's take a look at what's happened. So far in chapter 16, verse 19, we saw about Babylon being destroyed, but now we are going to be taking a look at what Babylon is and why it needed to be destroyed to begin with. So what we'll do again is try to follow the rule of let's make sure that we know for sure what we know for sure, and then we'll get to the mystery parts. Okay, let's take a look at it. We are in chapter 17, and let's begin with verses 1 through 3. One of the seven angels who had the seven bowls came and said to me, "Come, I will show you the punishment of the great prostitute who sits by many waters. With her the kings of the earth committed adultery, and the inhabitants of the earth were intoxicated with the wine of her adulteries." Then the angel carried me away into the spirit into a wilderness. There I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was covered with blasphemous names and had 7 heads and 10 horns. Okay, so what's going on here? First of all, chapter 17 begins the third vision of the book of Revelation, and this vision will last until chapter 21, verse 8. Remember, back to the beginning, the entire book of Revelation is made up of 4 separate visions that John has. We know that it's a new vision because he's in a new location and because of the phrase "in the spirit." So that's what's happened so far. The first vision was John in church on the Lord's day on the island of Patmos. Vision 2 was from heaven, from the doorway of heaven. Now, John is no longer seeing the vision from the doorway of heaven. This vision, as we've seen, takes place in the wilderness. Now, note where it mentions the beginning of the vision. It says that it's from one of the 7 angels who had one of the 7 bowls. So we've seen the 7 bowls of God's wrath poured on the earth. This now doesn't say which angel because it doesn't really matter. What it matters is that this next vision is now a direct result of God's wrath upon sinfulness. So that's where it comes from. And this angel, it says, carried me away in the spirit into a wilderness. So this is from God, but this vision is about the wrath of God poured upon a sinful earth. But it comes through one of the angels with the 7 bowls. So the fact that the vision comes from one of the angels as one of the 7 bowls tells us 3 things. One, it tells us that this happens during the tribulation. Remember, the 7 bowls happen during the last half of the tribulation. Secondly, we know that this vision happens throughout the tribulation. It's because it's one of the 7 bowls and not a specific bowl. It can happen at almost any time during the tribulation, but probably during the last half, or what's called the Great Tribulation. We also know that what happens, and let me get my head out of the way of this third point here. There we go. We also know that what happens here is a part of God's wrath because it's coming from the bowls which are filled with his wrath. And remember, since this comes from the bowls, this is also coming from the trumpets. This is also coming from the scroll, which is the title deed to reclaim the earth. How do we know that? Because we saw that way back in the beginning. The scroll is the title deed to reclaim the earth. The seals are open. The 7th seal reveals 7 trumpets. The 7 trumpets are blown. The 7th trumpet reveals the 7 angels with 7 bowls. And this says that this comes from one of the angels with one of the 7 bowls. So while it's a separate vision from the vision where we saw the scroll and the seals and the trumpets and the bowls, it nevertheless is related to that. I know, again, complicated and challenging, but when you piece it all together, that's what we get. Again, we're not talking about things that we're not sure about. We know this for sure because that's simply how it's linked in the book. What all of that means is up to interpretation, but that it says that is not up to interpretation. That is simply what the book tells us. So we don't know what specific time this happens, although we do know it's during the tribulation because it doesn't say which angel brought it. And I think that's intentional because it's telling us it's not specific about a time. It's not concerned about a specific wrath, but it is telling us that it is from the wrath of God. It is a part of the destruction of Babylon that we've already seen a precursor to in our last session from chapter 16, verse 9. So, what is Babylon? Let's take a look at some of the clues. In verses, let me see here. Let me fix that up for you. There we go. There we go. In verses, make sure there's no arrow in your way. There we go. In verses 4 through, continuing 1 through 6 now in verses 4 through 6. The woman was dressed, this is Babylon, the woman. The woman was dressed in purple and scarlet and was glittering with gold, precious stones, and pearls. She had a golden cup in her hand filled with the abominable things and the filth of her adulteries. The name written on her forehead was a mystery: Babylon, the great mother of prostitutes and of the abominations of the earth. I saw that the woman was drunk with the blood of God's holy people, the blood of those who bore testimony to Jesus. When I saw her, I was greatly astonished. So there are several clues in this passage about the identity of Mystery Babylon. We won't go through all of them because there's so many of them. The first one's dressed in purple, scarlet, gold, stones, and pearls. That means royalty and wealth, obviously. But let's take a look at the other things that it says about her. First of all, going all the way back to verse 1. In fact, we'll take a look at it this way. We'll put this little chart up here for you. And again, I got to minimize my head and get myself as far out of the way as I can so you can see this entire chart. There I go. I'm still here in the corner, but you'll be able to see the rest of the chart now. There we go. Okay. So take a look at it. We're going to take a look at the verse and then the clue from the verse and the meaning of that clue. So in verse 1, we see that she was a prostitute. That word in Greek is actually the word porne, from which we get pornography. So there's some kind of sexual immorality going on here, some sale of sexual indulgences going on here in some way or another, okay? The meaning of that, as we've already seen, anytime that adultery is seen symbolically in Scripture, it is always a symbol of, adultery is always seen as a symbol of idolatry. So there is probably some actual sexual sin going on here, but more than that, it's probably signifying that this will be a time of great idolatry. Also in verse 1, it says that she sits by many waters, which means she rules the people of the world. Waters is typically a symbol of the sinful Gentile nations. Verse 2 tells us that she committed adultery with the kings of the earth. And again, adultery means idolatry. So she commits idolatry, but she brings others into it. She does it with the kings of the earth. She brings all of the leadership of the world into leadership of idols. Also in verse 2, it says that she's intoxicated, which means a loss of reason, or she's intoxicated the world. She brought the world under intoxication, which means none of this really makes any logical sense. It's just the world's gone crazy. Verse 3 also tells us that she's sitting on a scarlet beast, which means she's working with the Antichrist, the beast being the Antichrist. She has blasphemous names written on her, which means she's anti-God, and she has 7 heads and 10 horns. Heads and horns are always symbols of power. So, heads are symbols of intelligence, and horns are symbols of power. So, this being is bringing the entire world into a place of idolatry, bringing the leadership of the world into a place of idolatry. And it's not because it's pro-idol, but because it's anti-God. And this is all under the power of the Antichrist, but it's done in a way that seems reasonable and intelligent, even though there's a loss of reason in this. It's a whole mix of all of those things going on here. And we see that just in those first few verses. So that's something you may want to take a screenshot of because there's a whole lot of information in that. Let's move from there now to the next verses, verses 7 and 8. Then the angel said to me, "Why are you astonished? I will explain to you the mystery of the woman." Ooh, pay attention to that, right? Anytime the book of Revelation says, "I'm now going to explain it to you," this is the foundation on which we built, the stuff that is explained. I will explain to you the mystery of the woman and of the beast she rides, which has the 7 heads and the 10 horns. So we're being very specific. What are you going to explain to me? The woman and the beast. Which beast? The one with 7 heads and 10 horns. So we know clearly what this is an explanation of. Verse 8. The beast which you saw once was, now is not, and yet will come up out of the abyss and go to its destruction. The inhabitants of the earth, whose names have not been written in the book of life from the creation of the world, will be astonished when they see the beast, because it once was, now is not, and yet will come. So that triplet of once was, now is not, and yet will come was explained twice, which means it's really important. So let's take a look at what happens in these 2 verses, verses 7 and 8. First of all, the angel is explaining the vision of the woman and the beast. This is a direct explanation. So always one of our basic foundational rules is use the biblical explanation first before we rush to our own interpretation. So let's take a look at it. The one phrase that's repeated twice, so it's the most important phrase in the 2 verses, is this is the beast that once was, now is not, and will come. So Babylon, this woman, Babylon, once was, now is not, and is to come, which means a reference to the ancient Babylonian kingdom. Babylon was a great kingdom. At the time of the writing, it is not a great kingdom. So it once was, now, during the writing of this, is not, but will come again. So this is a direct reference to the idea of Babylon. The Babylon that was, the Babylon that ruled the world will come back and rule the world again. Does that mean literally from Babylon? Maybe. Ancient Babylon is what we know as modern day Baghdad. Babylon also comes from another place that sounds much like Babylon. Babylon, the first 2 syllables of Babylon is what? Babel. Tower of Babel. There's a reason it sounds the same, because it is the same. Literally the first place where a city got together, a group of people in a city got together to defy God was Babel. That later became Babylon, and it will come back again. So this idea of building kingdom of heaven on the earth for ourselves, trying to attain heaven for ourselves, denying God, that whole idea will come back again, possibly in the actual place again, which would be near modern day Baghdad, which is in modern day Iraq. So whether it's in that city or not really doesn't matter, but this will be Babylon rebuilt, the place of defying the power of God and trying to create or reach heaven ourselves will come back again. So that's what this is a reference to. Verse 9 then says this calls for a mind with wisdom. Like, take some time to figure this out. There's a reason it's called Mystery Babylon, but it's also revealed, so let's take some wisdom to figure it out. This calls for a mind with wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 hills on which the woman sits. Now, we've seen this already, right? 7 hills. What does 7 hills always mean? In the day that John wrote this book, there was one major city that had been built on 7 hills, and it was the city that ruled the world. It was Rome. So the 7 hills means that Babylon will have similarities to Rome. So what does this mean, like, geographically? People are always wondering about that. And I don't know that the geography matters a lot. Does it mean that it's actually going to happen in Rome, like the actual physical Rome that we know of today? Does it mean that it's going to happen in the actual physical Babylon, which is Baghdad today? Does it mean that there will be a double ruling between those 2 cities? Or does it simply mean that the power of Babylon will be resurrected again, but it's going to rule the world the way Rome ruled the known world at the time that John wrote this? So to the original readers, they're reading this and going, oh, Babylon's going to come back again. And it's going to have 7 hills. It's going to sit on 7 hills, which means it's going to have a power like Rome has complete power over our lives today. Babylon will come back and have complete power over the lives of the people on the earth in that day. At minimum, that's what it means. Whether it's the actual physical cities or not, that's something we can have, debates and speculation on forever. But what we know for sure from Scripture is that it will be a resurrected Babylon in its intensity and in its denial of the power of God, and it will have a worldwide reach like Rome had at the time that this book was written. That is for sure from what we have here already. Now, let's take a look at a continuing about the description of this, verses 10 through 13. So in addition to it being Babylon, in addition to having the power of Rome, here's what else we know about this rising of Mystery Babylon. They are also 7 kings. So we got an ancient power that isn't anymore. We got a current power that is when John wrote it. We've got 2 different cities involved. And now, verse 10, they are also 7 kings. Well, might as well. They got 7 horns. 7 horns are 7 powers, right? So they are also 7 kings. So they're not just on 7 mountains, meaning Rome, but they are also 7 kings, which means 7 different kingdoms. They are also 7 kings. 5 have fallen. 1 is, the other has not yet come. Does that sound familiar from before? We'll come back to what that means again, right? But it's sounding familiar, doesn't it? But when he does come, he must remain for only a little while. The beast who once was and now is not is an 8th king. He belongs to the 7 and is going to his destruction. The 10 horns you saw are 10 kings who have not yet received a kingdom, but who for 1 hour will receive authority as kings along with the beast. They have one purpose and will give power and authority to the beast. Is that sounding familiar to anybody? It's sounding familiar, deja vu, because we read those exact verses back in chapter 13. Because back in chapter 13, when Babylon was first introduced, we jumped ahead to give you a description of it. So we won't spend a ton of time on it now because we've already looked at it. But here's what we looked at back then. The 5 kingdoms that have fallen were Assyria, Egypt, Babylon, Medo-Persia, and Greece. Those are the 5 great world ruling kingdoms that had come before. The one kingdom that is, at the time that John wrote this, was Rome. The one kingdom that has not yet come, which will be called Babylon, which will have the power like of Rome, is the kingdom of the Antichrist. And then there will be an 8th kingdom that comes out of that, and it will be ruled by the Antichrist in 10 different divisions. Really complicated. Who knows how all those numbers are going to come about? But that is what we know for sure from what we've just seen. Because remember, this is the angel saying, this is me. I'm telling you what Babylon is. This is filled with symbolism, but it is an explanation of a mystery. So we know these things for sure. We've already seen the 10-fold kingdom in Daniel, the toes of the great statue in Daniel chapter 7. You can go back and take a look at that if you want. All kinds of different numbers. There's a group of 3 that seem to take the dominant power out of the group of 10, which may be like a security council with the Antichrist as its head. So between this and Revelation 13 and Daniel chapter 7, there are 1,000 different ways to interpret what the numbers mean, what the cities mean, how all that comes together. But the certainty is that a new kingdom will arise. It will defy God like the original Babel and the original Babylon defied God. It will have worldwide power like Rome did at the time of John. That's what we know for sure. Let's move on from there to verse 14. They will wage war against the Lamb, but the Lamb will triumph over them because he is the Lord of Lords and King of Kings. And with him will be his called, chosen, and faithful followers. So the Antichrist will go against God at the Battle of Armageddon and will lose. So that's why, while there's a whole bunch of interesting stuff about the Antichrist and about Babylon and what it means and all those numbers and horns and heads and hills and a woman and adulteries, and while all of that is so crazy and confusing, the bottom line of it is this is demonic powers coming together to try to defeat God. They will, in fact, wage war against God, against the Lamb, specifically Jesus, and will lose. So that's what matters more than anything else. Doesn't matter how big or how scary or how many numbers you want to put into it. It's interesting. We're supposed to take a look at it because we're supposed to approach it with wisdom, as we saw. But the main thing about wisdom is to understand that they will lose. This will happen at the Battle of Armageddon, and they will lose. And the Battle of Armageddon will close out the tribulation, because at the Battle of Armageddon is when Jesus returns, as we'll see eventually in this. We now move from there to verses 15 and 16. Then the angel said to me, the waters you saw where the prostitute sits are peoples, multitudes, nations, and languages. Again, we already looked at this in 13. We jumped ahead to this. The beast and the 10 horns you saw will hate the prostitute. They will bring her to ruin and leave her naked. They will eat her flesh and burn her with fire. Okay, wait a minute. The woman is Babylon, who is demonically influenced and is against God. The beast with 10 horns is also anti-God. So aren't they on the same side? Yes and no. They are on the same side, as in they've got the same enemy, but they also hate each other because they're sinful, and that's just what sin does. So the beast, who hates God, will turn against Babylon, who also hates God, and she, Babylon, will be destroyed by the beast. So the beast is probably an individual, or at least a single power. Babylon is this confluence of multiple powers. And what's going to happen is, in the confusion of this axis, that was the phrase that was used right back in World War II, the Axis power. So you've got this group of evil nations, evil people, evil powers of some type. They unite so that their power can be huge, so that they can defeat God, but they can't defeat God. And out of that rises one who dominates the others and basically kills that entire axis, that entire group of evil that tries to come together is defeated and comes under the power of a single Antichrist. So when they do, when that happens, the beast will actually destroy this entire axis, this group of evil that's coming together. So they're going to try to bring everybody together. They're going to try to have and at the time, they go, oh, we brought peace and prosperity. Look, everybody's agreeing. All these different people are now agreeing together to go to war against God. But even in that, you're going to have power plays, and eventually the beast is going to win. And what's going to happen is the beast is going to use this mix of religions, which is also included in Babylon. The beast is going to try to use this conglomeration of powers as long as it suits him, but eventually he's not going to share power with anybody. Again, because he's a counterfeit to God. God's power will not be shared with anybody, and so the beast who comes along is going to want to be like God and not share power with anybody. God does it because of a righteous and holy motive, and the beast will do it because of unrighteous and unholy motives. But it's always an attempt to duplicate what God is trying to do. So that's verses 15 and 16. Let's now jump to verse 17. For God has put it into their hearts to accomplish his purpose by agreeing to hand over to the beast their royal authority until God's words are fulfilled. So God is in control of this, even in this thing where all the evil groups try to come together to defeat God. And all those evil groups end up turning on each other. And out of that one person, the beast, controls all of them and defeats all of them. Even in the middle of that mix, this is all being orchestrated by God himself for his purposes. Verse 18, the woman you saw is the great city that rules over the kings of the earth. So the woman, Babylon, mystery Babylon, on 7 hills. So the woman who comes from Babylon, from the original Babel, where the tower was built, right? The original idea of finding heaven for ourselves, or of creating heaven on earth for ourselves, will come again. It will get to the point where it gains worldwide dominance like Rome did at their time. And it looks like it is going to happen from a primary city. Will that primary city be a resurrected Babylon just outside of modern day Baghdad? Or will that primary city be actually located in Rome? We don't know. But because those are the two cities that are in play here, some of the speculation about who the Antichrist might be goes all the way from the Roman Catholic Church, because they're in Rome, to modern day Islam, because that comes from that area of the world around Baghdad, to maybe it's the military industrial complex, right? There's all kinds of different things, to Illuminati, to all the other conspiracy theorists that are out there. Almost all of them draw imagery from this. I think we need to be very careful when we're taking a look at any of this, not to disparage or taint good people who were involved. For instance, in the Catholic Church. I'm not Catholic. I have big disagreements with Catholic theology, but I also know really good Catholic people who really know and love Jesus. And I'm not going to disparage all of them by saying it's got to be the Catholic Church. I don't know what it's going to be. Could it be in Rome, and that they use the power and wealth that is established in Rome through the Catholic Church for evil purposes? Possibly. Could it involve Islam? Possibly. Could it involve massive corporations that come out of America? Possibly. Is it likely that the original conglomeration of all of these powers are bits and pieces from all of those that the Antichrist exploits and then defeats so that he rules over all of it? Probably. Probably. That's my guess on all of it. But it will happen at a city. And here's an interesting thing. The word metropolis, from which we, when we think of not just Superman, but basically any large city is called a metropolis. That's actually from two Greek words, metro meaning mother and polis meaning city, the mother city. So even the term we use for a large, powerful city, metropolis, means mother city. So what city? Rome? We don't know. Baghdad? We don't know. Jerusalem? Maybe. Washington, D.C.? Probably not. But all we do know is this: ancient Babylon will rear its head again. The worldwide domination like Rome had at the time that John wrote this will happen again. They will all gather together in one way because they have a common enemy to try to defeat God. They will not be able to defeat God, but the beast will take all of them under his thumb in his desire to make war against God. And all of that is coming to a head eventually in a couple chapters at the Battle of Armageddon, which is still on its way. Okay, that's it for today. We'll see you next time.